Welcome back to the Indiana Jones in History podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jacobs. Last time we answered the question, why does that belong in a museum? Today we are going to take on a much more difficult and politically sensitive question, namely, who enabled Indiana Jones? All right, how did he actually succeed on the ground when he was doing field work? Because remember, he is not acting in isolation. The Western archaeologist is surrounded by tens, sometimes hundreds of other people. The locals, local laborers, local chiefs, local officials, whether it's in Egypt or in China. What did they think about what he was doing? Because unless the Western archaeologist came in with guns blazing, then he must have had some sort of a relationship, a constructive, non-hostile relationship with the local officials, or else he would not have been able to get anything done. And that is what we want to look at today. You can see here that in the course of these episodes, we're moving from sort of a large, abstract, bird's eye perspective and asking who was Indiana Jones and identifying major themes. Then we move down to the ground level and we look at the big institutions that served as a form of enablers for expeditions, the museum. And now we're going to go one step further and actually get to the action on the ground where the excavations are taking place and try to reconstruct the local scene to understand what is going on. Now, the reason I said that this is a politically sensitive topic is because when you start asking the question, who enabled Indiana Jones, you start having to examine the non-Western actors who come into the picture here. Okay? And by suggesting that they were the ones who played a part, a very large part, not the entire part, but a large part, in facilitating the actual course of an archaeological expedition or excavation on the ground, we are coming dangerously close to quote-unquote blaming the natives for the loss of their own treasures. Okay, and that is an argument, that is a finding that is not very popular in an academic environment. Okay, it's not very popular among anyone of a liberal political persuasion. We want to identify and sympathize with people who we imagine were victims of unequal power forces, in this case, victims of imperialism. And it's often assumed, I would argue, without a whole lot of evidence actually, it's often assumed that archaeological expeditions must have succeeded because there was a power imbalance and the Western imperialists coerced the locals and sort of strong-armed them, twisted their elbows into doing their bidding against their will. Okay, and I'm going to argue that this is a product of a different time and place, a post-nationalist era in which artifacts were regarded as symbols and emblems of any given nation. And once that occurs, someone who takes those things away from your nation is regarded as a thief. They are criminalized. That is largely a product of the post-World War I era, as we're going to explore in great detail in episode 4. In this episode, we are going to learn how prior to World War I, criminalization was not the discourse that was invoked by all local actors. I have found zero evidence in my own research that anyone in China called or regarded the Western explorers as thieves during the day and age in which these expeditions were actually taking place. All right? And that's what good history has to do. We have to reconstruct the original context of whatever subject we're studying. We cannot judge people back in time through history according to our present day values. We need to reconstruct, we need to understand what were their values at the time and judge them in accordance with their own values. Because God help us if 100 or 200 years from now, future historians look back on the first couple decades of the 21st century and they judge what we're doing now, what we're saying now, the things that we do, they judge it according to their criteria, their moral criteria of 100 years hence. And we have no idea what that criteria is going to be. We can't conform to that. And we're very likely going to be excoriated, condemned by them for doing things that to us seem perfectly appropriate and admirable. I think this is the right thing to do. We'll go to our graves thinking that we did the right thing. No. You did the right thing in accordance with the values of your own day and age. Values change from generation to generation. So it's imperative that we understand the original context for these expeditions. And that requires us to go into the minds as much as we possibly can of the non-Western hosts and labor force who became inextricably bound up, associated with archaeological expeditions. Okay? And so that means what we're going to have to do here is I'm going to have to introduce to you a source base of evidence that is drawn from non-English materials. So the examples I'm going to give you for this talk, who enabled Indiana Jones, are going to be drawn largely from my own research on the Silk Road area of northwestern China. Okay, so I'm going to try to give you insights into the minds and thoughts and calculations, strategic calculations of the local Chinese officials, the central government Chinese officials, who were tasked with hosting and facilitating the expeditions of foreign archaeologists. And then to the extent possible, again, we're going to try to give voice to the voiceless Muslim laborers who were drawn upon to help the foreign archaeologists dig. And so you're going to become very familiar with some of the names of the explorers that I study. Orlstein, first and foremost among them, born Hungarian, eventually became a British citizen, studied at Oxford, and then worked in the British Raj in India, and used that as a springboard to hike over the Himalayas into northwestern China, into the region known as Xinjiang by the Chinese. That's where the Taklamakan Desert is, and that is where conditions were very ripe, just like the Egyptian desert, for long-buried antiquities to be uncovered by the archaeologists. Okay? And my argument in this talk, where we're going to be wading through a political minefield, because we are going to have, at the end, we are going to come to politically incorrect conclusions. Okay? And that is, namely, I'll give you a little preview here of where we're going. Bail out now if you don't want to see the end result. Is that the non-Western natives, okay, had a legitimate stake in their own eyes in helping to facilitate foreign expeditions. They did not see them as criminal, and they thought that what they were getting in return for helping the expedition was more valuable than what the archaeologist was taking out. And it never occurred to them that in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time, their own descendants would look back on this era from a different value perspective and say, hey, what you guys did was wrong. We don't agree with your calculus anymore. And we regard what you did as selling out the nation. Okay? And my argument is that far from blaming the natives, instead we will recognize their active participation and their legitimate self-interest. Self-interest not in a bad way. Self-interest, just they had a legitimate self-interest in getting something from these expeditions. And by doing this, by recognizing this, we will restore agency to the non-Westerners. We're not insulting them. We're understanding where they came from and putting their rightful voice back into the historical annals. They were aggressive historical actors in their own right. They were not passive props upon the stage. And we need to give them an active role on the stage that recognizes their legitimate self-interest in these expeditions. All right, now, last time we talked about the museum, and we said that the museum was an enabler, the ultimate enabler. But then we backtracked a little bit and we recognized that it was chiefly a rhetorical enabler. Rhetorical in the sense that it was the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals, science, preservation, and public education. That was the ideal. More cynically, we sometimes regarded it as a form of money laundering for financial and political elites. Funding and supporting and helping to construct a museum legitimized, naturalized, and embodied the power imbalance both between the elites and their own domestic lower classes at home, but also between the wealthier Western empires and the weaker and poorer non-Western empires like the Ottoman Empire or the Qing Empire in China. The museum was a rhetorical enabler because it legitimized and embodied the power imbalance, but it did not create or perpetuate the imbalance itself. Because remember, museums don't have armies. Okay? It's sort of an obvious point. The museum itself did not send an army into another country. And in fact, antiquities in general were pretty much never taken at the barrel of a gun. Okay? And then once the non-Western countries, like the Ottoman Empire, like Egypt, like China, even when they create their own museums, it does not stop the exodus of artifacts from their country. Why? This is what we ended our last talk with, because prior to World War I, nearly every educated person, Western or non-Western, was a culturalist, not a nationalist. One of my favorite examples, and here I'm going to start getting you into the Chinese material that I'm going to use as evidence for this talk. One of my favorite examples comes from the financial commissioner Wang Shunan, who has a very high position in the Xinjiang provincial government in northwestern China. This is the Xinjiang, remember, this is the area where you have the Silk Road, the Taklamakan Desert, where so many expeditions will take place. Wang Shunan, writing in 1911, 10 years after the first major archaeological expeditions have begun in his territory. The Silk Road expeditions begin at the last few years of the 1890s, and they continue to about 1915, about 15 years or so of German, French, Japanese even, British, Russian expeditions to the Silk Road routes of Xinjiang. Wang Shunan, who was one of the highest officials in this province where stuff is being removed from, in 1911, he writes a tract that summarizes the antiquities that have been found in his province. And he talks about things that the Chinese are finding, and he talks about things that the Westerners are finding. And at one point, he says the following. He says, the Western regions was once a flourishing area for Buddhism. Therefore, the manuscripts that have been found in the ground are of the highest quality. Unfortunately, he says, most of them have been taken by Westerners. But, he continues, the earth does not love its treasures. Who knows how many more will come out of the ground for us to find? Now, this is a wonderful quote. In it, you see a preference expressed for the best art and antiquities to be found and kept by himself. Of course, he would prefer that art and antiquities remain close to home. But Wang Shunan here doesn't criminalize the removal of such things abroad. It's unfortunate. It's a shame that we lost the race for these antiquities. But in this quote, you see Wang Shunan not putting forth the idea that these belong to us by natural birthright just because we're Chinese and they were found in China. No. He believes in finders, keepers, losers, weepers. And he's weeping here because the Westerners found it first. And once they found it, the sanctity of private property kicks in because this is a pre-nationalist age. These artifacts don't belong to a nation yet. The idea of a nation sometimes doesn't even exist in the minds of these people. They're loyal to the individual emperor, not some abstract nation. Okay? So because, this is our important point here, because the artifacts, art and antiquities were not seen as a criminal act when they were removed, the foreigners were not criminalized when they removed things in these early years, the artifacts themselves were viewed as a form of non-monetary currency, that is, capital, that different classes of people, different economic classes of people, spent in different ways. Okay? My hypothesis here, which I'm going to attempt to prove over the course of the next hour, is that when the value of what was gained by the native host exceeded what was lost, then the transaction was considered legitimate at the time by both sides. Antiquities were a barter arrangement. The antiquities trade was a barter arrangement in which one side valued one thing, the antiquities. The other side said, well, those things, we value those too to a certain extent, but it's not as valuable as what we think we can get from you in exchange for helping you remove it. Okay? Now let's begin with the passport. We want to understand how these expeditions begin. The passport that foreign archaeologists use to go to non-Western countries to undertake expeditions provide the first clues into who enabled Indiana Jones. Okay? And I've seen many passports in Chinese for the foreign explorers who went to Xinjiang to excavate Silk Road treasures. And on these passports, a lot of it's standard diplomatic language. But there always is a very interesting passage, one that reveals the power imbalance that existed between strong Western empires and weaker non-Western empires. And on Aurel Stein's passport for a second expedition, you can see very clearly there's this area where you have these red circles right next to the Chinese characters. About 10 of them for 10 Chinese characters. That was their version of underlining something to draw attention to it. And you realize this is the passage in the passport that the local Chinese officials who have to inspect Stein's passport and host him have to pay particular attention to. They said, okay, this is the most important part of the passport for me. And the language is as follows. 立即查验放行，教约妥为保护，勿得流难阻治. Roughly translated, promptly inspect his papers and allow him to proceed. Protect him in accordance with the treaties. Do not put any obstacles in his way. Now, if all we had was this document, it would seem like imperialist coercion, right? Seems pretty clear. The unequal treaties are being invoked. The unequal treaties being a result of Westerners winning a war against the Qing dynasty, the Opium Wars. But we're going to learn that this is a deceptive facade. And that behind the passport, there were many other forms of compensation that Chinese officials of all sorts and the uneducated, illiterate, impoverished Muslim commoners received from the foreigner. Even the passport was still representative of a form of compensation. Okay, I refer to these compensations sort of tongue-in-cheek as the compensations of plunder. That's the title, actually, of the book that I'm writing right now. The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures. And the compensations of plunder is tongue-in-cheek because I'm making the argument that if the native hosts, if everyone in the actual location of where the fieldwork was to take place, other than the foreign archaeologist, regarded what was going on as a form of barter transaction in which legitimate forms of capital were exchanged back and forth, and they didn't regard it as a criminal act at the time, then it can't be called plunder. To call it plunder is to use the value system of later generations to retroactively condemn people who did not view it that way. Hence the compensations of plunder. That's what we're going to be talking about today. What were these compensations? The first compensation was a form of diplomatic capital. The Western consular officials in the embassy and the consulates who apply for a passport on behalf of their country's Western archaeologists to go to China are tacitly offering a form of diplomatic capital to the weaker non-Western government officials who are going to issue this passport. Put yourself in the shoes, or felt slippers, if we're thinking about China at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, put yourself in their felt slippers and understand what they want. They are presented with an application for an archaeological expedition on behalf of Aurel Stein. Okay, they look at this and they say, what do we want in exchange? If we approve this application, what might we be able to get in return? Well, we need to ask the question, what do weaker states want? If there is a gross imbalance of wealth and power in the world, what do the weaker states want? They want alliances, they want attractive loans, they want trade concessions, they want tariff reductions, they want arms sales, they want technical advisors from the more industrially advanced nations. They also want to be viewed and accepted as a modern civilized state. Okay? Things like extraterritoriality, which was a very common thing in most non-Western countries for Western citizens. Namely, you're allowed to travel throughout Egypt, throughout China, and not have to abide by local laws. If you get in trouble, you'll be judged by your own court. The local officials cannot judge you and cannot punish you. Okay? The unequal treaties, which are imposed on non-Western countries after wars are fought and lost, are things that institutionalize unequal economic arrangements. Okay? These things are perpetuated. Extraterritoriality is perpetuated by a perception of your country as backward and unscientific. Okay? And for people like the Chinese, being labeled backwards and uncivilized is a shock. Because to them, they spent the last 3,000 years thinking of themselves as the most civilized people on earth. With good reason. And all of a sudden, in the course of some 30 years, they find these upstart white people show up out of nowhere, win a few wars, and then tell you you're uncivilized, you're barbaric. The Westerners came in and they saw things like the legal system, the form of punishments that the Chinese had. And they fixated on things like the death of 1,000 cuts, dismemberment, usually the worst punishment that could be doled out if a wife killed her husband or someone rebelled against the emperor. And they saw the death of 1,000 cuts and they said, this is evidence of your barbarism. You guys aren't civilized. And once that stigma takes hold, it's very hard to get rid of. And all the Westerners are calling you backward, uncivilized. How do you get these labels off of you? You modernize in accordance with how the Westerners modernize their countries. You undertake Western reforms. You try to reform your legal system and remake it in the image of Western legal systems. Most importantly, you try to claim the mantle of scientific modernity. All right, that's what you want. You want the Westerners to regard you as rational, scientific, modern people who evolve and change just like the Westerners do. Remember, the Ottoman Imperial Museum, which was founded in 1846, had mannequins of the Janissaries. The whole point of that was to prove to the Westerners that we move beyond our outmoded institutions that are no longer suitable for the modern world. We can evolve too, just like you do. We don't stagnate. You can't apply the label of Oriental stagnation to us anymore. All right? So from the perspective of the host official, the host country, an application from a Western country for an archaeological expedition to take place in your country is an opportunity for the weaker party to curry goodwill with the stronger party in exchange for something viewed as far less valuable than the antiquities being removed. Because before nationalism, the antiquities are merely precious. They aren't priceless. And in the case of antiquities dug out of the desert sand, they don't even cost you anything. They're just sitting out there. No one owns them. It doesn't cost anything to the host country when the foreigner takes that away. So these applications for an archaeological expedition from the host country's perspective, it's sort of like a signing bonus or giving stock options when you join a company. It sweetens a larger diplomatic negotiation. Okay? You want to approve these applications for foreign archaeological expeditions because you're hoping that the Western nations will now regard you as scientific, as modern, as reforming. And then as a result, they might say, hey, you remember that extraterritoriality? I guess we can consider abolishing that now because you guys are making great strides towards modernity and becoming just like us. All right? And the important point to remember here is that if the perceived compensations of hosting an archaeological expedition do not outweigh the perceived losses, every state everywhere in the world at all times was free to refuse a passport to a foreign archaeologist, no matter how weak they were. Let me give you an example. Afghanistan. From 1900 to 1940, Aurel Stein wants to go to Afghanistan to do an expedition. It's his lifelong dream. The fact that he keeps on going to Xinjiang in northwestern China was his backup plan after he gets rejected by tiny, weak, insignificant Afghanistan, whose foreign affairs are largely controlled by the British anyways, and Stein's a British citizen. Nonetheless, the Emir of Afghanistan consistently suspected that the British and Stein were not only going to do archaeology, but they were going to map his land and record local conditions, and then use that information to prepare for a possible military invasion one day. He was probably right in some way that was a legitimate suspicion. Stein would have mapped the land, he would have taken note of local conditions, and he would have been just fine handing that material over upon his return to the Raj. Okay, but that's not the point. The point we want to understand here is that Afghanistan is one of the weaker, insignificant nations of the world at this time period, as far as great power politics is concerned. And yet, the Emir of Afghanistan repeatedly refused entrance to his country to Aurel Stein to do an archaeological expedition. And the British couldn't do anything about it. No one's going to war over an archaeological expedition application. No one's going to war over that. Now, what does the Emir of Afghanistan risk if he rejects an application? He risks the British calling him unscientific, uncivilized, not sympathetic to modern progress. Because you want to facilitate science, right? It's all about science. That's the rhetorical enabler. This is all about science and scholarship, that's all. Well, it's not all about that. But nonetheless. So the Emir is going to make himself vulnerable to being regarded by the Westerners as a barbarian still. Well, so be it. He apparently was fine with that. But the point is that any country was free to reject these applications. You may not like what the Westerners are going to say about you. Ooh, mean words. But you can deal with it. These are grown men. They can handle it. And the Emir of Afghanistan did. And said no. Over and over and over again. And every time he said no, Stein said, fine, I'll go to Xinjiang then, where the Chinese welcome me. The irony of ironies, Stein, when he was, I think, 82 years old, in 1943, finally gets permission to go to Afghanistan. His lifelong dream to go to Afghanistan. He finally gets there. Within a week, he catches a cold and dies. And he's buried, actually, in the English cemetery in Kabul. And after the military invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, some Westerners got back to that cemetery and took a picture. Aurel Stein's grave is doing just fine in Kabul. All right, so the lesson that we've learned so far. The passport for a Western archaeological expedition was issued in the context of a gross power imbalance. But that power imbalance only created incentives to approve that passport, not an obligation. Always remember, no archaeologist took any artifacts away at the barrel of a gun. The only time that happens is during actual war, like when the Nazis do it. Or when the British and French sack the Summer Palace and take things away. Outside of a war context, regular peacetime archaeological expeditions, which account for the vast majority of artifacts that are removed from non-Western countries, did not succeed because they had military force. So the context is a gross power imbalance, and that creates incentives to agree to an expedition, but not an obligation. Afghanistan accepted, most states leaped at the incentives that the Western countries could offer in exchange for facilitating an archaeological expedition. Remember, before nationalism, antiquities are cheap and plentiful and not regarded as priceless. They cost you nothing to let the foreigner take them away, because he's not going into private collections and stealing them from homes. He's going into the desert and digging them for himself. Antiquities are relatively cheap and plentiful. Diplomatic capital is rare and expensive. It's very difficult to curry goodwill with a powerful Western country that doesn't really need much of what you have to offer. Or you can give them more trade concessions, but that's really going to hurt. Or you can approve an archaeological expedition and gain goodwill and a reputation as a supporter of modern scientific techniques in that way. One great example is Cleopatra's Needle. That's the the anachronistic name given to an obelisk that was gifted by the Pasha of Egypt in the 1880s to the United States in thanks for the United States remaining neutral as Britain and France maneuvered to try to take control of the Egyptian government. The Pasha wanted to have a way to curry goodwill, diplomatic capital with the United States of America. So he said, all right, I don't have any money, I don't have any resources that they actually want, I don't want to give any real concessions. How do I curry goodwill with America? Let's take this 3,000-year-old obelisk, which cost me nothing, and offer it to them. And he did. So the obelisk traveled to America, and they set it up in Central Park in New York. A wonderful example of voluntary diplomatic capital being received in exchange for the gift of an antiquity to a foreign country. Okay? Think of Cleopatra's Needle in that sense, in Central Park in New York, as a preemptive compensation of plunder. With plunder, of course, you always have to have quotes around it because it's not really plunder when it's given voluntarily and something is perceived as being received in return. Now you might say, well, that's an exception because the Egyptians, we know that that's where you have a perception of cultural discontinuity, right? Most of the Egyptians don't actually culturally identify with the ancient pharaonic past, and they regard them as heathens. Okay, well, let me give you an example from China then, where you have a perception of cultural continuity with pretty much everything that comes out of the ground. In 1905, the Qing Dynasty Manchu official Duanfang makes a trip to study the constitution and governments of all the Western nations. Because the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese Qing Dynasty, is intent on reform. They want to change. They want to modernize. They want to become like the Western states and understand the secrets of the wealth and power of the West. Duanfang gets to Chicago, and the Field Museum is recently constructed. So he says, I'd like to give a gift to the Field Museum and ingratiate myself with my hosts so that they recognize me as someone who supports modern scientific scholarship. So he gives them a 7th century BC Taoist stele, very valuable to the Americans. He's currying diplomatic capital, diplomatic favors from them in exchange for a stele which he regards as precious, but not priceless, and therefore it can be used in barter negotiations to receive something in return. Now, outside of these forms of diplomatic capital, which are usually obtained and sought after by central government officials, the government officials in Cairo and Constantinople and Beijing, we need to shift our attention to the local officials on the actual frontier where the expeditions are going to take place. The expeditions don't take place in Beijing or Cairo or Constantinople. Most expeditions and excavations actually take place in fairly remote areas, often on a frontier. That's often why no one has stumbled upon these artifacts yet, because they're way off in the middle of nowhere, where no one thinks to look for them. Regardless, they're not in the middle of a metropolis. Okay? So we need to go to the borderlands, to the peripheries, to understand what are the local officials posted to the peripheries. What do they want? What do they see in a foreign expedition that they can benefit from? Okay? Nothing is possible for the Indiana Jones in history. Nothing is possible without the active, enthusiastic support of the local non-Western host. In our case, we're going to be talking about the Chinese hosts, the Chinese officials posted to the northwestern frontier. And the archaeologists admitted this time and time again. They said without the proactive and enthusiastic assistance of the Chinese officials in every single oasis that I visited around the Taklamakan Desert, there's no way in hell I would have been able to get donkeys, camels, guides, laborers, carts, grain, or bank services that I needed to do my excavations. No way! This isn't London. You can't just go to the bank. You can't just order your food and what you need and 10 pounds of grain for your horses. You have to have the assistance of the officials. Now you may say, oh, but we saw the passport. The passport had language that obliged the local Chinese officials to support the foreigners. That's right. they were obliged to make sure that no harm came to the foreigner. The language was, inspect his papers and let him go. Protect him in accordance with the treaty. That just means no harm befalls him. He doesn't die. Because if he dies, then we're going to be in big trouble with his government. And don't put obstacles in his way. That's all it said. It didn't say, go way out of your way in making sure that every single thing this guy wants is procured without delay. Okay? And the local officials, they have what scholars refer to as weapons of the weak. If they don't want to help an expedition, they can drag their feet on provisions. They can intimidate the local population, the labor force that the foreigner wants to hire. They can intimidate the local population with repercussions. If you help the foreigner, then after he leaves, there's going to be repercussions. To the central government, they can invoke the specter of unrest, especially on the frontier, where oftentimes it's a culturally and ethnically alien population. They can say the people don't really want this foreigner here. They're suspicious of him. They're scared of him. He's going in. They can invoke the specter of cultural anger. They can say he's going in and digging up graves. He's messing up the feng shui of the land. He's angering the local genies, the local spirits that many of the people there believe in. And it's ruining our harvest, our crops for the year. These are called the weapons of the weak. And when Beijing comes back and says, hey, the British ambassador is pretty upset that you're not helping Aurel Stein, what's going on? They can say, well, I'm very sorry, but we're a poor oasis and we don't have any provisions for him. And if I take things from the people, these Muslims will rebel against our Chinese authority. They're already pretty upset that he's digging into local graves. He could totally say that, and Beijing would say, you know what, okay. And then he'd go back to the British ambassador and say, sorry, these are the reasons why our local officials can't help Stein more than they are. Okay? But these weapons of the weak were rarely resorted to. Because, like the imperial officials in Beijing, Constantinople, and Cairo, the local officials posted to the impoverished frontier also saw a range of incentives in the foreign archaeologist that compelled them to offer their enthusiastic help, as did the local population, the masses, who will provide the labor force. So here we go. We're going to talk about the three forms of capital that the local officials and the local peoples who actually facilitated the on-the-ground excavations and fieldwork, what sort of capital did they receive in return? And we're going to look at three forms: political, social, and economic. And this will help us answer the question, who enabled Indiana Jones? And I emphasize for the umpteenth time, we're not blaming the natives for facilitating a foreign archaeological expedition. We are restoring agency to them by recognizing their legitimate stake, their legitimate self-interest and profit that they could obtain according to their own value system, not ours. Political capital. Let's start with political capital. This is for the local officials. All right, the local officials who actually look at Stein's papers, approve his requests, facilitate logistics, help him get money, exchange money, get hay for his horses, procure camel men, all of that stuff. Political capital was leveraged in two ways: as a rhetorical model for Western science, and as a concrete solicitation of Western scientific advice. Let me give you an example of rhetorical model for Western science. What do we mean by this? In 1900 to 1901, Aurel Stein does his first expedition to Xinjiang in search of Silk Road treasures. In 1901, he writes up a preliminary report on what he's found and what he's taken away from China. This report is received by the Chinese governor, Rao Yingqi, in Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang. And Rao Yingqi sees this English report, what Aurel Stein did in his province, and he commissions a Chinese translation. He will say, what is Stein saying about our province? I'm very curious. And the report is translated into Chinese by a man named Wan Rong, a Chinese official. And in the preface to this Chinese translation, Wan Rong gives his opinion about Aurel Stein and says the following: aspirations of studying natural phenomena lead to wealth and power, But the principle of going from studying to political might seems coincidental to people. They all marvel at the natural sciences and are in awe of Western weapons and technology. Yet when it comes to seeing Mr. Stein crossing mountains and rivers, or traveling through the desert, our Chinese officials laugh at his folly. This is just being ignorant. All right, what does this mean? What is Wan Rong talking about? This is an era in which China is trying to reform on the model of the Western countries. In fact, most archaeological expeditions take place during a time frame in which the host country has already decided we need to modernize, we need to reform, so we can catch up to the Western countries. Stein does his first expedition in Xinjiang, and the governor, the translator for the governor, looks at him and says, this is an example. Stein represents the secrets of Western wealth and power. Look what he's doing. This is the spirit of exploration, going out and tracing things to their source, of acquiring new knowledge and understanding the world. That, he says, is the secret of the natural sciences of Western weapons and technology. So, and Stein's doing it here. Stein is a distillation, a representative of what the Westerners did to achieve so much wealth and power in the world. And so he says, some of our Chinese officials, they see Mr. Stein crossing mountains and rivers or traveling through the desert, and they laugh at his folly. This is just being ignorant. It says, he is showing us in our own backyard how to become like the West, the secrets of wealth and power, the scientific spirit. And clearly the governor of the province agrees. The highest Chinese official in the province agrees. He commissioned this translation. This is like a CEO of a company lauding the performance of an employee of the month as an example for other employees to follow. The governor of Xinjiang is giving notice to all of his local officials throughout the province that Stein represents the wave of the future that we need to emulate. And these local officials took notice of what their boss told them, what their CEO told them. On January 1st, 1908, the French sinologist Paul Pelliot recorded the receipt of several gifts from the local Chinese magistrate of the oasis of Turfan. Read out his diary. Quote, this is Pelliot's diary in French. I send the magistrate's little book on Turfan back to him and ask him for the map he promised me. My guide not only brings me back the map, reproduced with great care, but a large placard where Zheng Binghuang, the magistrate, celebrates my scientific merits. Listen to that. The local official of Turfan, a place where lots of antiquities will be taken away by the foreign explorers, is he sitting there going, Pelliot has taken away all of our antiquities. He's a thief and I can't do anything about it. No! He gives him a map. He gives him a little book on Turfan introducing the region. And then he gifts him a large placard celebrating his scientific merits. Zheng Binghuang, the local magistrate, has taken notice of the governor's opinion of Stein. That employee of the month thing about Stein is paying off. And the local officials are now saying, yeah, these guys, these foreigners, represent scientific progress. The secret to their wealth and power, what we need to catch up, is on display in our own backyard. And he's enthusiastic about having Pelliot there. And the second form of this political capital is that the archaeologists put their scientific knowledge to use by offering tangible engineering and irrigation advice to the local officials. They were more than happy when asked, how do we solve the problem of creating better irrigation in our oasis so we can increase the population, get more tax revenue, and use that tax revenue to modernize our country so we can catch up with you? Did the Western explorers say, oh, we don't want you to catch up with us. I'm not going to help you out. You're on your own. No. When they were asked for the fruits of their scientific and technical knowledge, they willingly gave it. Remember, the foreign archaeologists are, they have PhDs. Stein is a PhD from Oxford. Out on the impoverished and isolated frontier, that's a rare commodity. Think about that. You're thousands of miles from Beijing. You're in the deserts of Central Asia. And here you have a PhD from Oxford with significant worldwide experience at your doorstep all of a sudden. You didn't have to pay a dime for him to show up. And he can tell you, he can give you advice on how to improve the tax revenue of your oasis. On July 26, 1907, a local Muslim chief asks Paleo to weigh in on the question of whether or not a tunnel could be built for irrigation purposes. Quote, Taimur Beg told me that about 2 years ago, some peasants went to see if a tunnel could be built to supply their water to supplement the shortfall in the Kucha River. Some have concluded that it is possible, others that it is not. He hoped that I could clarify the question, which is of paramount importance. One would not hesitate to spend 70,000, 80,000 taels for such an enterprise. Taels is a form of currency. So it's a very big, important project, and they want his input as the vital piece of information they need to decide whether to go forward with this irrigation project or not. On March 25th, 1908, Oral Stein records the following conversation with a local Chinese magistrate. Quote, exchanged visits with lively old magistrate who had come into charge some 8 months ago from Ely. Seems anxious to develop the district and followed eagerly my explanations about Punjab irrigation. Remember, Stein was a civil official in India, so he has colonial development experience from his time in India that he is sharing with the Chinese officials. March 31st, 1908, Stein offers the help of his Indian surveyor, Lal Singh. Quote, I was taken out of my way by a big posse of officials to inspect the new canal of Sampula, which is to reconquer quite a goodly slice of desert. The main object was to get help for a correct alignment of the canal. So Lal Singh is to go out and do the needful leveling by the clinometer. I stipulated as my royalty an annual present of walnuts to be duly dispatched to Kashmir when the trees of the new colony will have begun to bear fruit. He's joking here, okay? He's not really getting anything in return. He has sent his Indian surveyor to go help them do a needful leveling for the canal so that it's straight before they build it. June 28, 1908, a Chinese official asks for irrigation advice drawn from Paul Palaiot's tenure in French Indochina. Palaiot is French, and he can draw on the experience from French colonies. The sub-prefect, Li Yingjiu, told me that almost all the land immediately irrigable has been cleared here. The rest is invaded by salt that should be washed away to make it flow. The sub-prefect asks me if we have no plant to absorb this salt. I tell him that, to my knowledge, the best way is to make canals on these lands and flood them from time to time. And I ask him why they do not try Noria, a chain pump, at the base, supplementing the elevation with buckets as the fields in the Tonkinese Delta are farmed. And on December 19th, 1913, Stein's advice is credited with saving an oasis. Saw camels off by 9 a.m. and followed with whole posse of sheiks and laborers for start on new site. Loose soil close at hand from Tamarisk Cone to the west, but no skilled labor to secure it by solid palisade. Will the river, after lake has been formed, seek a fresh outlet elsewhere? My interposition thought particularly timely because the river's flow below the Mazar has begun, as I subsequently verified, and was expected to reach the site in 4 to 5 days when the work would become much more difficult. Tokta Akun, in the presence of the sheiks, agreed to send me 5 dry apricots year by year as a tribute on Oasis Saved. Again, it's a joke about the 5 dry apricots. But he's lending his scientific advice to help facilitate the development of the local economy, essentially. And just so you know, these are unpublished diary entries. These were not things that the foreign archaeologists bragged about at home and said, look, this justifies my expedition because I'm so good to them. They didn't publicize this stuff. If you don't look in the archives, you'll never even know that this sort of stuff happened during the expedition. Now, what we also see are various other forms of compensations that I regard as political in one sense or another also. The Chinese hosts wanted Western approval of their militaries. They regarded the opinion of the Westerners very highly, and they often put on military displays for the Westerner when they showed up in their region. They often bonded over guns. Remember, the Western explorers often had military experience. They were very proficient in firearms. And every single time, so many times I'm looking through these diaries and I realize that the foreign explorer shows up and he's taken by the local military official to his armory and they bond over guns. They talk about the latest guns in Europe. And sometimes the local officials even ask if the foreign explorer will give them a gift of the latest pistol or European gun. I've also seen requests for Western medicine for various bodily ailments. By this point, it was generally seen that local medicine, whether it was Chinese medicine or whatever, indigenous medicinal methodologies, were seen as inferior by this point to Western medicine. And so time and time again, you read through the diaries, and again, this is stuff that often was not published in later accounts. And you see every single time the foreign archaeologist shows up in a new place, everyone comes out. The locals come out, the impoverished commoners, the elite officials, and they start asking him for medicine. Do you have this? I have this ailment. I have that ailment. Can you help cure it? Right? They're seeing in him another concrete compensation that is the fruit of Western science, superior medicine. You're not going to antagonize someone like that, especially if you don't regard him as a thief in the first place. My favorite example is several times I've actually seen examples of local officials. Usually it's local officials or at least local notables. It's usually not the impoverished masses who basically ask the foreign explorer for the 100-year-old equivalent of a Viagra pill. I swear to God, I've seen this several times. My favorite example is Paul Paleo. At one point, he's talking to, I think, a 75-year-old Muslim man, a headman of a village, so someone who has some wealth and power. He's well into his 70s. Paleo says that he's constantly talking about women and all of his conquests in bed and whatnot, and he says this is a lecherous old man. Nonetheless, he travels with him for a while, and they have a conversation. And at one point, this Muslim man asks Paleo, "Do you have any Summer of St. Martin in your pharmaceutical bag?" And I have no idea what Summer of St. Martin is. I was befuddled by this reference. So I went online and I started searching around. What the hell is a Summer of St. Martin? And it turns out it's a French phrase that is sort of the equivalent of the English phrase Indian summer. Unseasonably warm weather late in the year. That's the French phrase for that. The Summer of St. Martin. I'm like, okay, that's interesting, but what does it have to do? This doesn't make any sense. He's asking him for unseasonably late weather, warm leather. Warm leather, that's a good one. Warm weather late in the year. I thought, in his pharmaceutical bag. And then he continues and says, although there is the precedent of the Duke of Richelieu, I dare not tell him this. Duke of Richelieu. Well, I type that up. I find out who the Duke of Richelieu is. It's some French lech, I think from the 17th or 18th century, who fathered children well into his 70s. And suddenly it dawns on me, this man's asking Paleo for boner pills. That's what he's asking him for. Do you have boner pills that you can give me? He wants unseasonably warm weather from Paleo's pharmaceutical bag so that he can be like the Duke of Richelieu and father children well into his 70s. So, that is a form of compensation. Next time you're at a museum and you see an antiquity taken away from China, you can say, hey, you know how that got here? Boner pills. Viagra. I could go on and on with such examples, but the point is, you don't antagonize a highly educated man from the most industrially and scientifically advanced nations on Earth, especially if you have no prior reason to hate him anyways, and you don't regard him as a thief, and you don't regard the stuff he's taking away as priceless and emblems of your nation. Instead, you pick his brain and you strive for his approval of your modest strides toward modernity, and you attempt to leech his resources to the greatest extent that you possibly can. In short, you want invaluable advice, you want calculations on infrastructure maintenance and development, and you want medicine to save or improve lives or give you an erection. All he wants in return is a bodhisattva's head, and he's willing to pay all of his own expenses to procure it. And the bodhisattva's head doesn't cost you anything anyways because he dug it out of the sand. Moving on from political capital to social capital. What is a form of social capital? Well, I believe that this form of capital most clearly reveals the voluntary nature of the aid. Okay? Social capital is when you meet someone who is, to your eyes, outstanding in some way. Maybe you saw Brad Pitt on the street. You saw a celebrity. or you even met him in some context, what's the first thing you're going to do when you go back home or you see your friends? You're going to say, "I met Brad Pitt!" Or if you got a picture with a celebrity, you're going to go on Facebook and you're going to post a selfie with you with that celebrity. And then you're going to eagerly sit there and wait for everyone to like it and make comments and say, "Dude, that's so awesome. I wish that I was you." That's a form of social capital. Social capital is when you can brag or have stories or things to share about having met a magnificent person or someone that will capture the attention in a subsequent social context. And you want to show it off. And you'll be the center and life of the party because you have the best story to tell. That's a form of social capital. Okay? We love it. We crave it. When everyone's paying attention to us in a very positive way and they're jealous of us. So what is social capital in an archaeological context? Archaeologists, to their native hosts, were maverick celebrities doing innovative things that no one had ever done before. Remember the preface to the Chinese translation of Stein's report, talking about how he's climbing mountains and crossing rivers and doing things that no one's ever done before. All right? He's seen as a pioneer. And he's impressed by this pioneer. And he's bragging about it. Look what he's doing. Isn't that incredible? No one's ever thought to do this before. Wow! And then they want to tell you all about it. So you're jealous of the fact that I have some sort of association with him. Add further to the fact that on the distant impoverished frontier, the local official, whether in Egypt, in Turkey, or in China, is a very isolated person. He's also educated and probably wealthy. He doesn't really connect or bond with his impoverished, illiterate, dirty subjects. He often looks down on them and despises them. He's bored. He is really bored. He very rarely has an opportunity to interact with other social elites of his same economic class. And when the foreigner comes in, the very embodiment of Western science and modernity, coming with gifts and new guns and cool stories about other places throughout the world that he's been, and tales about how irrigation is done down in Vietnam, he's a maverick celebrity. And then he's going off into the deserts and doing expeditions at things that people have no one's ever done before. Stories about the foreign explorers would resonate and continue to be told for generations after the expedition was over. The elites, the common illiterate masses. I've seen this. People go into Xinjiang in the 1930s and 40s, and the people are still telling tales about Oral Stein and the incredible feats he was able to accomplish that no one had ever done since or after had ever done before him or since. And they're bragging about having been associated with him because he's a maverick celebrity. Now, the Chinese officials themselves were also highly educated, cosmopolitan gentlemen who revered classical antiquity in all of its forms. So foreign archaeological expeditions, which were trying to uncover the material remains of classical antiquity, that resonated deeply with the Confucian elite of China, who also revered antiquity and lionized the well-traveled gentleman scholar. And since pre-World War I Confucians were culturalists, not nationalists, antiquities were merely the price one paid to secure a prestigious friend. And heck, it wasn't a price at all if he went out and discovered something that you didn't even know existed until he found it. Did the local Chinese officials hone their weapons of the weak? No! They stumbled over one another to wine and dine men like Stein, to talk about antiquity, to discuss world affairs, and get a photo op with him. In 1930, Dai Cheng-mo, the prefect of Keria Oasis, brags in a letter, a Chinese letter that he gives to Stein, about his own admirable qualities, and then says that Stein surpasses them all. Quote, this is a Chinese letter that I found in the archives of Stein, written by this local Chinese official. This is the translation. In years past, I traveled through Russia, Germany, and Austria, the Mediterranean Sea, and numerous ports of call. I have friends all throughout the world and no lack of able and impressive men among them. He's bragging about all the great friends. He's bragging about his forms of social capital, the stories he has to tell when he gets to a party. No lack of able and impressive men among them. But in the year 1913 at Caria, I obtained a friend in Mr. Stein, a great official of British education. Stein worked in a college in northwestern India. He is a superior man, morally upright, highly educated, and with a vast knowledge and understanding of all things ancient. Reading his essays and books today elicits a deep sense of respect and admiration. Stein's no thief to Dai Chung Mo. He's the most admirable, incredible, pioneer, maverick celebrity he has ever seen. In 1907, Zhu Ruichi, the magistrate of Pishan, writes to Stein and says, quote, "Everywhere you set your foot, dear sir, becomes famous. From the luster you confer on the sands of the Gobi Desert to the distinction you confer on the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains." He's writing about Stein as if he's some famous Chinese poet traveler or scholar, and everywhere he goes becomes famous by its association with Stein. Pan Zhen, the superintendent of Aksu Oasis in 1907, praises Stein's education, scholarship, travel, and books, and then contrasts these with his own shortcomings. He says, quote, "In serving as an official on the frontier, I have left my tracks over more than 10,000 miles, and in times of leisure I have waited and browsed through books so as to obtain a coarse understanding of the affairs of the world, and yet I have never once set foot outside of Asia. As a result, I am as a man who looks at the world through a tube and measures things with a calabash. You, great sir, have traversed the oceans and expended yourself in magnificent explorations. Be it the traces of the ancients or the customs of our contemporaries, there is not one that you have failed thoroughly to uncover and investigate, presenting them in expansive books of great importance that encompass everything you have experienced. This is truly worthy of an admiration that knows no bounds." Wow! The same official, Pan Zhen, after he's been transferred to Urumqi, the provincial capital, in 1913, hears that Stein, on his third expedition, is nearby in Turfan, only a couple days' march away. And he hears that Stein has decided that he won't come to Urumqi to see Pan Zhen. Pan Zhen, who regards Stein as a good friend by this time, is disappointed and makes it known. And I have this wonderful little piece of paper that I found in the archives, in which the postmaster, the Italian postmaster hired by the Chinese in the city of Urumqi, writes a little note to Stein. He says, I saw Pan Zhen yesterday and gave him your message, i.e. the message about not coming to Urumqi. He seems a little disappointed that you should be so near and yet not think of coming to Urumqi so that he might again see you. This is the Chinese official saying, I wish Stein would come visit me. Okay, because he's a dear friend, or because I can leverage social capital from my association with him. And then here's a very touching letter. 1926, Wang Min, the son of a recently deceased magistrate who was friends with Stein, who hosted Stein on one of his expeditions, receives a letter from Stein addressed to his father who has just died. So Wang Min writes back to Stein himself and says the following. Unfortunately, my father never got a chance to read your letter in person. This is cause for enormous regret. If only he could have seen it with his own eyes before he passed away, who knows how high his exuberance would have enabled him to leap. Whenever I think of my late father, I recall how every time he chatted with his friends, he would suddenly change the topic to talk about your broad learning and thorough understanding of Eurasia, and he would narrate your travels in Xinjiang. He singled out for particular praise your steadfast determination to succeed despite untold sufferings unimaginable to others. Truly, these were things that no one else could measure up to. I used to listen in on these conversations from the side and became quite familiar to them. Now, even if we control for hyperbole and exaggeration, still, these are extraordinary testaments to the social capital archaeologists offered to isolated and bored officials posted to distant backwaters. Listen to that line again. Whenever I think of my late father, I recall how every time he chatted with his friends, he would suddenly change the topic to talk about your broad learning and thorough understanding of Eurasia. And he would narrate your travels in Xinjiang, singling out for praise your steadfast determination to succeed despite untold sufferings unimaginable to others. Stein is the most incredible friend that Wang Ming's dad has ever met. And he brags about him to his other Chinese friends. Is this someone who is smarting at the loss of cultural treasures? No. This is someone who has received valuable social capital in return. And this social capital was invariably sealed by the taking of a photograph, oftentimes with the foreign explorer, or a picture of the foreign explorer. Over and over again, photos were exchanged among these elites. Okay, that was like accepting a friend on Facebook back then. You give him your portrait. And we know that these portraits of foreign explorers were highly valued by the local officials. In 1907, Stein noted that the local prefect of Hami, the Oasis of Hami, keeps an album of his European visitors. In all of his books, Stein published photos of his favorite officials, the officials that helped him the most. And these books were eagerly sought after by those Chinese officials as a form of social capital. They weren't embarrassed, they weren't ashamed that their photo appeared in a book in which Stein narrated the removal of cultural treasures from China. They were proud of the role they played in facilitating the expedition of the most incredible scientific celebrity they had ever met in their life. I helped him. I know him. They collected those books and they showed it around, and they saved those pictures, and they eagerly sought out photo opportunities with the foreign explorer when he was there. The Chinese officials also competed to exchange Chinese poetry with the foreign explorers. Poetry in the Chinese literary world is the most prestigious form of literature. In 1906, a Chinese literatus insists that the French sinologist Paul Pelliot come to his house to see a poem he had written. Quote from Pelliot's diary, "A Chinese resident here came to talk to me and insisted on taking me to his house, where he showed me a poem he had composed. After returning to my house, the Chinaman brought me another poem." In 1907, the Finnish explorer Gustav Mannerheim is given a poem by the son of the local prefect. Quote from his diary, "As I was writing these lines, I was interrupted by another call from the same young man. He brought me a poem he had written in my honor, a curious form of politeness to a stranger." Like celebrities, sometimes archaeologists were asked to add their inscription to a scroll or write their own poem, or in one case, a baby book. In 1930, even after the Chinese central government on the eastern seaboard had branded Stein a criminal, Stein made a trip to Nanjing and Shanghai, and he was asked to make the first entry in a baby book of one Chinese official's 5-month-old son. Quote from Stein's diary, "Mrs. Zhang presents her nice little daughter of 2.5 years and chubby Zhang Bingjong, the 5-month-old boy. I was asked to write the first entry in his scarlet biographical volume." The opinion of the foreign explorer was so esteemed that one magistrate insisted that Gustav Mannerheim, the Finnish explorer, see his wife's face. They usually kept their women tightly cloistered and out of view. One official actually said, "I want to bring my wife out." And then he trots her out on her bound feet. And she's all demure and shy and has her head down. And he asks Mannerheim, "What do you think? Is my wife prettier? Or is the wife of the magistrate in the next oasis over prettier? Which one is lovelier?" Mannerheim says, "Of course your wife is more lovely than the other guy's wife." And the magistrate is delighted with Mannerheim's assessment. Right? That's a form of social capital. The approval, the stamp of approval of the foreign archaeologist saying your wife is prettier than your rival's wife. Unsurprisingly, when it became known that officials were gaga over foreign archaeologists, everyone else followed suit. When the governor of the province said, "I love Stein, he's a model of Western scientific modernity, let's emulate him," the local officials followed suit. When the local officials found that they had a lot of social capital that they could draw out of Stein, or Pelliot, or they could ask him about irrigation advice, and they would help, then they too said, "These guys are great." And then all their underlings would see the example and they'd say, "Well, if the local magistrate loves him, then it must be someone that I should like too." My favorite example comes from Stein's fourth expedition to China in 1930 to 1931. Stein has already been branded a criminal by this point because this is after World War I. But you see this strange disconnect between the newly educated younger Chinese officials on the eastern seaboard in Nanjing and Shanghai and Beijing who are saying he's a thief. But when Stein gets back to Xinjiang, clear across the other end of the empire, he encounters the old Xinjiang officials who were educated prior to World War I. And they don't regard Stein as a thief. And what's fascinating is that during this expedition, the central government requires that a local Chinese man, Zhang Hongsheng, is attached to Stein to make sure he doesn't take anything when he goes through the province. Okay, so that's the situation we got here. Stein is allowed to do an expedition, but he can't remove anything. The local officials still love him like they used to. The young educated officials after World War I on the eastern seaboard call him a thief, and they forced Zhang Hongsheng, a guy who works in the Kashgar post office, to accompany Stein to make sure he doesn't steal anything. All right? And as you see in Stein's diary, Zhang Hongsheng is trying to maneuver a delicate path between two ideologically irreconcilable parties. The new Chinese who see him as a thief and the old Chinese who see him as the best thing since the Mantou. According to notes in Stein's diary, Zhang Hongsheng, every single time he would show up in the government office of an official who loved Stein just like they used to love him 30 years ago, he would change his attitude towards Stein to correspond with that of the local official. He could move back and forth between Stein's a thief and Stein's the best thing ever. Let me give you some examples. On 3 separate occasions when Stein notes that Zhang Hongsheng is displaying what he calls disingenuous sympathy, all involving a local official who admires Stein and disagrees with the characterization of him as a criminal coming out of Nanjing and Beijing. In May 1931, quote from Stein's diary, "To the magistrate, Zhang relates at length the obstructive action of a previous magistrate at Caria, which he now ridicules and condemns, after having before fallen in with it. Obviously a clever opportunist who knows how to turn his coat." Later that same evening, quote, "Zhang talks of my so-called harmless survey of the Nia site and is evidently bent to display his superior comprehension of such work and his sympathy with my aims." 2 weeks later, at another lavish banquet thrown in Stein's honor by a local magistrate. This magistrate, evidently no admirer of Nanjing, thinks that its obstruction can only be due to ignorance of my aims and labors. Zhang chimes in sympathetically to suit our guest, forgetting apparently his conduct at Malakalagan, Nia, Koyumal, and ill-disguised threat at Temenpo. Zhang, as usual, adopts attitude corresponding to that of visitor and displays hearty sympathy with my aims. How different from his conduct in Caria area. See, what Zhang Hongsheng is doing is he wants to improve his career. And yet he's caught between 2 ideological poles. On the one hand, he hears from distant Nanjing that Stein's a thief, and if you want to be on good terms with the people who hold power in central China, you have to regard him as a thief and watch him and obstruct him. But to the local officials in Xinjiang who might actually help Zhang Hongsheng's career, once he realizes that they like Stein, he then tries to act like he likes Stein too, and he's not obstructing him. And he goes back and forth depending on the changing ideological poles of his day. This is why we cannot judge archaeologists according to our own values. Because in one lifetime, values changed from best thing ever to thief. And Zhang Hongsheng on Stein's 4th expedition in 1930 proves that wonderfully. Our third and final form of capital, economic capital. Economic capital in the form of wages is largely for the illiterate, impoverished lower classes who work as laborers. Related to that is what I would call maybe professional capital in the form of recommendations and promotions for local officials and local elites who help the foreign explorer and then who helps them get promoted. On the topic of economic capital, I found a letter in Stein's archives written in Chinese by Xie Weixing, the magistrate of Khotan in 1908, in which he says the following: "The most commendable thing that your excellency did was to employ the people of my district, much to their good fortune." For Xie Weixing, Stein represented a sort of economic stimulus to a distant frontier. Foreign explorers spend a lot of money when they do an expedition. They buy camels, they buy donkeys, hay, provisions. They pay the local laborers who they hire. A significant amount of money is involved. And the value of these wages were enhanced for two reasons. The first is that archaeologists usually paid above market rate for unskilled labor. This is unskilled labor. Anyone can do it. In one extreme case, Paul Pelliot lamented how the German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq paid 5 times the going rate for daily labor wages. The second reason why these wages are of enhanced value is that most archaeologists did their work in the agricultural off-season when the desert wasn't so hot, thus representing additional side income. It wasn't like these people were being drawn away from their fields and couldn't work in their fields. It was the agricultural down season. And then when they got into the field to do work on archaeology, excavations, there was often an incentive scale of rewards. If you found more stuff or you found the really good stuff, you get even more money in return. As a result, most archaeologists had so many applicants for work that not a few had to be turned away. The Egyptologist Flinders Petrie observed that the peasants of Egypt were, quote, so glad to get regular pay without any deduction that they say they intend to work, whether their sheiks like it or not, as long as there is pay to be had. Note that line, whether their sheiks like it or not. The only grievance of the laborers was not that they were being exploited by the foreign archaeologists or that the foreigner was taking away their cultural treasures. It was related to the fact that they thought that the local middlemen, the sheiks, or in China it was the begs, were taking too big of a cut of their wages because the foreigner didn't pay the laborers themselves. He paid the middleman, the local middleman, the sheik or the beg, who then paid the laborers. And that sheik would usually abuse his power by taking way more money than he should have and then giving less money to the local people. So Flinders Petrie says, they say they intend to work whether their sheiks like it or not, as long as there is pay to be had. As a result, so long as they are paid regularly, Petrie concluded, the peasants defy anything short of open violence to stop them. On average, Petrie's men made about twice as much in wages as they would in their usual occupations. In fact, there was such an abundance of eager hands that Petrie once admitted to discharging for laziness freely, as there are so many applicants for work. The only time I've seen something in which the impoverished local people are hesitant to go work for the foreign archaeologist is when there are perceived occupational hazards. Sometimes they'll think, they may not come out alive of the desert. That rarely happened, but nonetheless, it was a concern. If an expedition was not properly outfitted, it could be dangerous way out in the desert, far away from anything. And so sometimes you do see that. But generally speaking, people were so enthusiastic to work for the foreign archaeologist that they could turn away people that they thought were lazy. Now, professional capital comes in the form of recommendations and possible promotions for lower-level chiefs and officials. Simply put, if the archaeologist likes you and the governor likes him, that is a recipe for promotion. Once everyone saw the affection of local power holders for an archaeologist, the archaeologist could wield the power of recommendation to his benefit. Incidentally, this is how the Elgin marbles will be removed from Athens. The Elgin marbles, originally, Lord Elgin, who was serving as the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople, his plan was to take plaster casts, plaster molds of the sculpture that adorned the side of the roof of the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. He never intended originally to remove it all. But when he sent his work team to Athens to get access to the Acropolis, that's the hill, the rocky outcropping on which the Parthenon stands, the local governor of Athens, the local Ottoman governor, turned his men away because he said the Acropolis is a military installation. We use it as a military base. The Parthenon actually had ammunition stores inside of it. That's how its roof got blown off in the 17th century when the Venetians attacked and had a direct hit on the ammunition box. And at that time, the French and the British were fighting in the Mediterranean, and the Ottomans were involved as well. This has to do with, Egypt and Napoleon's invasion. And right as Elgin's work team comes into Athens, the local governor of Athens, the Ottoman governor, says, no, you can't go up to the Acropolis because it's a military site, and France is sending its navy here. So you can't do it. So Lord Elgin in Constantinople goes back to the Sultan and says, hey, your local governor in Athens won't let my men go up to take the plaster casts that you promised I could take. So the Sultan sends his own emissary to Athens, Rashid Aga. And Rashid Aga finds the governor of Athens and tells him, if you don't let him get access to the Acropolis for these harmless activities that he was promised, we're going to send you as a slave in the galleys. And it's at that point that Lord Elgin's men, not Lord Elgin himself, who is still in Constantinople, approach the governor and they say he is in such a compromised position right now for disobeying the Sultan's orders that we get access to the Acropolis, that maybe we can even ask for more. And so without Lord Elgin's knowledge, the Reverend Hunt, Philip Hunt, who was one of his men on the ground leading the work team, goes to him and asks him, could we actually remove some of the sculptures from the Parthenon? And the governor says, absolutely. And in his letter to Lord Elgin, Philip Hunt says, the local governor who feels how strongly you have reason to oppose him and say a bad word about him to the Sultan now, is eager to do everything we ask. In other words, it was the power of promotion that facilitated the removal of the Elgin marbles. The British were helping the Ottomans fight the French. That's a form of diplomatic capital. And in exchange for that help, Lord Elgin was treated very nicely because he was the British agent on the ground. And if Lord Elgin wanted to take plaster casts of the Acropolis, the Sultan was happy to let him do so. And when the local governor of Athens realized that the Sultan really loves Lord Elgin, then he said, I want to please Lord Elgin. So when Lord Elgin's men asked, can we actually remove it, not just take plaster casts, he said, hell yes, do whatever you want, because I want you to recommend me. And that's how the Elgin marbles ended up in the British Museum. Same thing in China. In September 1906, Stein learns that, quote, Islam Beg, my faithful old guide, has just been promoted to a fat begship. And as news of this sort spreads like wildfire, I may expect willing services further ahead too. That same month, Paul Paleo says that his Turkic interpreter is, quote, quick to help people who are on good terms with the Kashgar circuit intendant. The Chinese official who earlier showed a sample of his poetry to Paleo ended that conversation by, quote, appending a verbal request to recommend him to the governor in Urumqi. I can easily imagine that he must not be overly pleased in this hole where there are in all 15 to 20 houses. When Paleo reached Urumqi, he found an official out of work who told Paleo that, quote, he would like another post and asked me to say a word for him, which I already did yesterday. In 1908, Stein found that his guide from his first expedition now lived in a much larger house than before. Reached Islam Beg's fine country house, a creation of Prefect Panjun's favor and my recommendation. Since 1906, he has advanced from the Mirab of Kayash to a fat begship. In 1904, Stein received a letter from a former Indian servant named Khandar Khan in Lahore, thanking Stein for helping to secure his promotion. Quote, permit me to inform you that I have been fortunate enough to receive the title of Khan Sahib on the New Year's Day. Whenever I think of the unique distinction that has been conferred upon me, I cannot help thinking that I am indebted to you more than anybody else for it. Kind and sympathetic as you have always been to me, I owe you almost everything good that I enjoy in this life. I owe my position and honor to you. That same year, Stein manipulated his power of recommendation to convince an official dragging his feet on Stein's logistical problems to step up his efforts. Quote, explained trouble with the ponymen and the desertion of one of the other men. Found out soon after that the commandant was out of favor with the governor-general, having failed to present himself when the latter took office on excuse of managing a flooded river. I emphasized my friendship with the governor-general and dropped a hint as to my eventual recommendation, which would help to make my host again persona grata. And the best example of all, the Yale climatologist Ellsworth Huntington undertakes an expedition to Xinjiang in 1905, and he relates the following account in a letter back home to his family in New Haven, Connecticut, about his meeting with the governor and bringing his Uyghur, his Muslim servant, with him to that meeting. And he says, quote, in his letter, that reminds me of Daoud, his name of his guide. His supreme ambition is to become a beg, not a big beg, but a little one with some simple authority adapted to his ability. As he has been very faithful, in spite of his shortcomings, I asked the governor to give him such an office. That is, to give him a letter to that effect to the local magistrate at Caria, telling at the same time what sort of man he is, faithful and honest, but not especially clever. The governor promised to do so, and when he called on me, he asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, most horribly frightened, was brought in, and after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground half a dozen times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, and one that he will boast of till his death. For as Ibrahim said, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the governor if he had paid $5,000. Isn't that a wonderful illustration of this professional economic capital? An impoverished, illiterate, local Muslim guide. You do good service for the foreign archaeologist in helping him remove cultural treasures that you don't regard as cultural treasures in the first place. And in exchange, he gets you an audience with the freaking governor of the province, who you could never obtain an interview with even if you had $5,000. Our conclusion, let's wrap this up. Gone on long enough. I know you're all tired. The archaeologist was regarded as a resourceful sahib, and he was explicitly referred to as a sahib, someone in a great position of power and wealth, whose resources could be extracted. First and foremost, the Western archaeologist was regarded as a resourceful patron who could dispense scarce and highly coveted resources to people from all walks of life. And the more important and resourceful he was, the more everyone wanted a piece of him, and they could care less how many antiquities he took away in return. A telling passage from Ellsworth Huntington's letters home reveals how the tight-fisted and eccentric behavior of his American traveling companion Daniel Barrett sorely disappointed the laborers he employed. I love this passage. Listen very carefully. The main grievances of the men were thus told to me. One is that the men have traveled with sahibs who were extravagantly liberal. They are ashamed of the parsimonious way in which this expedition has been run. I don't quite understand it myself, for at first Daniel Barrett seemed liberal and appeared quite ready to get everything that I suggested in the way of equipment. The other and chief grievance is that the men want a sahib who is a sahib. They are ashamed of a man who shuns his fellows, especially those who are great, dresses like a tramp, saddles his own horse, eats on the floor, takes his exercise naked where all can see him, sleeps alone in the mountains, never can tell beforehand where he is going. In short, as Rasul says, a wild man, an animal. If only I could laugh and say it is not so, I should not mind. But it is all true and has been troubling me for months. Here you see the perspective. As much as we possibly can, we can reconstruct the voice of the voiceless. This is a private, unpublished letter. Unless you think Ellsworth Huntington is lying through his teeth, you have to give some credence to this. His men, the local laborers, want the Western archaeologist to be as grand and resourceful and as powerful as humanly possible, because then they can benefit from all the fringe advantages that can accrue to them. They are ashamed of a man who shuns his fellows, especially great, he says. Because if he avoids meeting the Chinese officials because he doesn't like the ceremony and stuffy audiences, then they don't get to have access to the Chinese officials. They don't like a man who saddles his own horse, dresses like a tramp, because then in the eyes of the people, he's not a great man. And then they can't benefit from the reflected glow, the reflected aura of his greatness. The words of the British consul in Kashgar, Claremont Screen, who served there in 1922 to 1924, confirm the lack of appreciation for a cheapskate foreign explorer doing yoga in the mountains. Quote, "It must be remembered that one's prestige, and therefore that of the country one represents, depends very much upon the size of one's caravan. Nobody gives any credit for being a hardy traveler and a lover of the simple life. It is merely supposed that one is not a real sahib and cannot afford to travel any better." Most archaeologists were not like Daniel Barrett. They were real sahibs with valuable resources to their name, and they used these resources to procure artifacts that were viewed as far less value to the locals. This is why no one thought the Western archaeologist was a thief in his day. He was a generous hero in both Western and Eastern lands, and he was praised as such at the time. If you want to call them thieves and what they did plunder, go right ahead, but recognize that that's an anachronistic discourse that did not exist at the time these things were taking place. In order for the exodus of art and antiquities to stop, these objects would have to be infused with a value higher than that commanded by the various forms of capital dispensed by the foreign archaeologist. Only nationalism could do this. Only nationalism, a new idea. It's not more guns, it's not more wealth and power by the host country. It's the changing of ideas that will end Western expeditions. Nationalism will transform private property into a representative of the eternal nation. They'll say this artifact represents our nation, not your individual virtue as its private owner anymore. And when that happens, it will become political suicide for anyone in a position of power to let that artifact leave the country. Now, how this transformation came about, the effects of nationalism, and specifically World War II, are topics that we will explore in our next episode, Who Confronted Indiana Jones?